Okay, now that we've got an understanding of the appreciation that data was linked to strategic power back in the day, now let's think about where hackers came in. And again, I want to take you through a timeline and actually think about the time when hackers didn't exist, but when corporate IT did start to take off. So you're thinking about the 1940s to the 1950s, the really early days of IT. In fact, there was no such thing as the internet, not even as such. So essentially, these were standalone machines. And those early machines were always called mainframes. Now, we refer to these in our other modules. So, of course, all large machines at the center of a network that control other smaller devices. They often act as the servers for those devices. Those big device architectures are known as mainframes, and they really are the earliest form of IT hardware. Really big. You and I couldn't have afforded them. And of course, in the center of universities and governments and large organizations, even today, are massive mainframes. So in the 50s, no one really knew about IT except those people playing around with those mainframes. So this was a very dark art. And people who were into IT were a small, select team of people who were basically maintaining the system. And these mainframes were hideously slow in comparison to the sort of IT that we have today. But the key point from our security perspective is they were standalone. They lived in that particular corporation, and no one was really interested in causing malicious damage to them because nobody understood the value that was in there. Now, the key point to remember at this point is you couldn't hack it because you can't hack into a device without being connected to that device. And that is a key construct within this whole area of security. The way you are connected to the device that houses and holds the data. It was only when phone lines became common around the world, but more importantly, became intrinsically linked to IT systems where the problems began. Think about this. Phone lines started to blossom around the world. And of course, as phones became common, these were landlines, a new type of geek was born. They were very excited about this new technology, and they started to tinker with it. And of course, they were mischievous, and they realized that you could actually tap into people's phone calls simply by connecting to landlines and listening in on the conversation in the right way. They also played around with the idea of piggybacking or hijacking the telecoms landlines of the day and seeing what you could do with that. This became particularly interesting for a chap who called himself Captain Crunch. Now, he'd created a little blue box which could send a sequence of audible tones down the line. And if you could do that with this little blue box and send the right signals down the line, he realized that anyone could make free long distance phone calls using the telecom systems of the day. So this was that tinkering, but effectively that was the first hacking that took place in that sense. Word spread around American universities, and soon all the geeks were at it. They were playing around with these little blue boxes, if you can get them, and soon these blue boxes reached the campus of Berkeley University. And loads of software engineers started to toy around with this thing. Of course, one of those playful software engineers was a chap called Steve Wozniak. He explained the whole thing to his close friend and future business partner, Steve Jobs. And it wasn't long before Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak made their first use of this hacking device. They would put it to very constructive use, of course, and Steve Wozniak called and got through to the Vatican in Italy, pretending to be Henry Kissinger. And they pretended to ring the Pope on behalf of President Nixon. They actually got through to the Vatican, actually made it into the Vatican and directly to the bishop who was acting as the translator to the Pope. And it didn't go much further than that before they started to crack up and the whole thing fell apart. But the whole idea of the story I just gave you tells us two things about technology and about the hacking community, which echo even today. The first thing is that technology moves really fast, faster than the people who invent it, essentially. So when they introduce a new technology, very often the establishment that takes up that technology is slow to implement any radical change. The establishment generally gets on with using the technology only as it's supposed to be used, but they don't really think about any inventive way of using the technology beyond what they've been told. It's usually the tinkerers outside of the establishment who do the unexpected left field thinking, and they play around and think about different radical ways in which you can use this. And there was the rise of the cheeky mischief makers. Get this. In 1967, IBM invited a bunch of school kids to explore one of those mainframe machines that I'd been talking about. Bizarrely, the kids soon picked up the systems language, and they even broke into the operating system and started toying around with the operating system. And there, in 1967, the first true IT hack was made. Since then, IBM, of course, recognized the notion that defenses would be needed to put into place in software and to hardware to prevent malicious threats that could potentially destroy your system. By the 1970s, of course, in parallel, companies around the world had started to implement IT within their organizations. In fact, IT became a core part of most enterprise business models. And of course, the natural step is if you are a company around the world or around even a country, a large sprawling organization, the next step was to think of linking your IT systems together. And of course, the idea of remote access was born. And how could you link IT systems? There was only one way, by using the telecoms architecture of the day. Can you see how it's all coming together now? Telecoms and remote access linking critical pieces of IT within your organizations. That is where the seeds were laid for the current internet. But of course, before there was the internet, there was Arpanet. When Arpanet was born, we were in the period of the Cold War, where there was always this threat from the USSR. And one of the thoughts that came about with the US government is they were seeing how IT systems were really, really useful and becoming critical components within large businesses and government organizations. But one of the things they realized, of course, is that they needed a way of linking these things in the way that corporations were doing, linking their own servers with their own IT systems, but doing it in a way where if one of the servers was attacked, then there would be some sort of fail-safe mechanism, a network that would be so resilient that if one of the servers went down, the rest could handle it. Messages could automatically be diverted across the network, and so the connectivity could be used in a very clever way. They needed to come up with protocols. Protocols, by the way, in networking are ways of making networks work. So wherever you see terms like TCP/IP, it stands for Transmission Control Protocol, Internet Protocol. So you should think of protocols as software for networks, software that makes networks work. They realized that this idea of networking was brilliant. The idea of using the telecoms architecture of the day to link all their different sites across the US was excellent. But they still needed a way of making this network much more resilient, and they were thinking of it from a military perspective. What if the USSR tried to knock out some of our servers? Could we create a network that would be so intelligent that it could actually survive? It could automatically, intelligently send messages in a different way as to bypass the broken servers. That's where Arpanet came in. Arpanet was a huge project. It was effectively the precursor to the internet. And even within Arpanet, the notion of security was definitely there. It was a major concern. And there were researchers such as Bob Thomas, who had started to create programs such as Creeper. Creeper was a software that crept into the nooks and crannies of the network and taunted users by letting them know that it was there, teasing them with phrases like, "Catch me if you can." Of course, this program did no malicious damage. It wasn't designed to do any malicious damage, but it was there to highlight the fact that in the future, maybe a piece of software could be created by malicious parties that could freely wander around your system and potentially look at sensitive data, and then, of course, even carry out damaging attacks if necessary. In response to this, another software developer by the name of Ray Tomlinson, he who would go on to invent the email, created a software that was designed to go out and hunt down Creeper. It was given the name Reaper, and thus was born the first true virus, Creeper, and the first true antivirus software in response to that, Reaper. By the way, Reaper also did something fascinating. It knew how to replicate itself across your network. And so here was an example of what we call the first computer worm. A worm is a virus that keeps replicating itself once it's entered your system, and they can be incredibly harmful. Of course, the idea of security grew, and by the mid-1970s, Arpanet's creators and most of the world's governments realized that if you're going to use IT, then security must become an intrinsic element in the design and operation of any IT system. And the term information security, which would go on to become cybersecurity, was starting to be bandied around. As the establishment was thinking about how to secure itself, of course, outside of the establishment, people were starting to sprout up who were getting famous within this industry. One famous member of the community outside, looking to make their way in and making their name known, was a chap by the name of Kevin Mitnick. Now, he shared the common traits of the hacking fraternity: mischievous, youngster, bored, technically savvy, but a prankster really, and mildly anti-establishment in their leanings. Of course, these are all traits shared by the common hacker today. In a 2003 interview with a chap called Thomas Green, Mitnick explains what happened during his phone phreaking period. This is the phone hacking period. He says, "I became absorbed with everything about telephones, not only the electronics and the switches and the computers, but also the corporate organization, the procedures and the terminology. After a while, I probably knew more about the phone system than any single employee. And I had developed my social engineering skills to the point that at 17 years old, I was able to talk most telco employees into doing almost anything." Now, this tells you a lot about the characteristics of today's hackers. They totally get absorbed by one particular area of technology and how to control it and how to hack it. But they also become obsessed with all the elements surrounding that technology as well, including the human interaction and the social engineering aspects of it. Cracking an IT system today is as much a mindset of manipulating humans as it is about breaking the technology. So it comes as no surprise, eventually that teenager, Kevin Mitnick, was dared by his peers, his mates, to try and break into the Ark. This was a large mainframe system at Digital Equipment Corporation's DEC. It's worth noting how the 16-year-old managed to do it. And in his own words, he said, even as a teenager, it was a pushover. He simply made a phone call to help desk, pretending to be Anton Chernoff. Anton Chernoff was one of the project leaders, the lead developers, and also a systems administrator in the project. The help desk people didn't suspect a thing. And that help desk person readily issued Mitnick with a password that would grant him all the top level privileges of a systems developer. Effectively, a complete passport to roam around the system and make yourself at home. The password, by the way, was buffoon. After a number of similar escapades, Mitnick got caught and was jailed in 1999 after being on the FBI's most wanted hacker list for a number of years. He served 5 years in jail, 8 months which were solitary confinement, because the judge was so convinced that there was a man who could trigger a nuclear war by whistling missile launch codes down a payphone. Such was the fear people started to have about hackers and their dark art. Today, of course, Mitnick runs a very successful security and consultancy firm based in Las Vegas. The 1980s was a time of real tension, a Cold War tension between the two superpowers of US and USSR. IT was also in a very nervous state. Cyber espionage, Trojan horses, and viruses were terms that were becoming common usage within IT. More importantly, to bring the topic into the heart of popular culture, even films were made that focused on this. Films like War Games was launched. Here was a science fiction thriller that looked like it could be a very imminent reality. Matthew Broderick starred as that geeky, bright, young student, very technically savvy, ring any bells, who would hack into NORAD. And eventually, the plot line leads to a situation where a teenager could bring the planet to the brink of World War III.